I'm Sally Robinson. I'm the VP of Strategic Initiatives here at Upshop. And some of my focus is around compliance and really staying ahead of what's coming and we are all facing from a retailer perspective. It's great to see everyone in the room. I'm very excited to be here and talk to you about this topic. And Michael, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Sally. I'm Michael Lookup. I'm at Wegmans Food Markets. I'm leading our traceability efforts. But I come from our supply chain group, but also most recently was on our food safety and QA team, leading our recall, our food safety and QA systems and technology, and then supplier quality assurance. So this has been a topic of mine for many years. It's the topic that everybody wants to talk about, but nobody wants to talk about. So it's that topic.
Great, thank you. So we're going to touch on FSMA. So we really want to start with how did we come to be speaking about this in the first place? So when I think about FSMA and the road to it, it really starts with significant foodborne illness events that have occurred historically that really have spoken to how we need to respond in a way that's differently than how we've responded before. So the first one that I would speak to is really the peanut recall for PCA that occurred in January of 2009. And that's probably worth a deep dive just because it's a really good example of where FSMA came from and why this is needed from an industry standpoint. If we think about the peanut recall that occurred, it was one of the most exponential recalls that happened in US history. Funnily enough, with this particular recall, it wasn't really in retailer-based areas, wasn't specifically in grocers. It really was more large establishments like hospitals, schools, those types of networks. But what made it so expansive is it was one particular ingredient that spanned across 361 items, or companies, excuse me, that went to almost 4,000 products. And the impact of that overall was peanut sales in large categories like peanut butter in the grocery stores decreased by 25%. So even though that particular recall didn't even involve products at grocery or retail stores, it really had a huge impact on the category. And the response that happened to this one was really pretty long in terms of how long it took to go back and determine which products were impacted and how we pull them from the supply chain in general. So it's a really good example as we walk through this to really think through and apply back when we start talking about some of these topics. I would also say that when products like this get recalled, consumers get really concerned about whether or not these products are safe for them to eat, regardless of the brand, regardless of the variety. So another example is, historically we've had recalls around melons, specifically speaking about listeria breakout that happened with cantaloupe. And in general, consumers will go to the stores and they won't touch any cantaloupe. So it's really about the overarching impact of those recalls and how easily it is for us to track them back to the source of where they originated. And that's really some of those type examples. There's lots of recalls to talk about, but those are really the examples that drove FSMA to be part of the discussion.
Yeah.
So Michael, if you were to add on to that, what would be your perspective from where we are now with FSMA?
Yeah, certainly it was the FDA's response to these recalls, right? They wanted to increase traceability, but increase transparency from a consumer perspective. But FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act, is not new for us as retailers. It's been signed into law in 2011. I think things like FSVP, things around trailer cleaning. So it's a rule that really has been out there. The last section is at 204. And then certainly there's been a journey here. We've kind of known it's been coming. We've been trying to understand where it was going to be. There's a lot of interpretation being done. There was a comment period with FDA. But then finally, we kind of got the final rule as it exists in November of last year. And now we know that journey is going to hit the date of January 20th, 2026. But it's certainly for us, we're really still trying to kind of get our arms around it, understand how it ties into the new era for food safety. And I think that's a key component to this as well.
Yeah, great. just for our perspective, not to put anyone on the spot, so maybe show of hands of how many folks in the room are actually having discussions within their organization on this topic. Great. Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think an important part when we talk about FSMA is not to really only consider FSMA, but also consider where this is going in the future. So if you think about the new era for food safety, this is a blueprint document, some nice light reading for you to do at night. It's actually a 20-page document that they put together to really talk about where do we go from here and what does the future look like. It really revolves around 4 different channels, one being tech-enabled traceability, smarter tools to enable quicker response to foodborne illness, food safety as a culture, and really retail modernization. But I would say the key takeaway from that document is really visibility on where we're going. And that would be that end-to-end traceability. And what does that really mean? So it's really about looking at traceability as a whole in your organization in terms of how you think about it, how you work through those processes. And it's a really good starting point to think about from a document to really read and see what FDA thinks about from a future perspective. Would you add anything to that?
No, I honestly, if you're thinking about light reading, the rule itself is about 600 pages. So if you really want to help sleep at night, there you go. There's an opportunity there. So I can probably dig a little bit more into the rule itself and the regulation. So FSMA 204, what we're talking around food traceability for food. And it really is, if you boil it down to a few different key components, it's the concept of us as retailers or entities that produce, manufacture whole food product that exists on the food traceability list, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that list looks like. We have additional record keeping requirements. Those requirements are of 2 years. We have to keep all transactional key data elements across the end-to-end supply chain from all the critical tracking events that are part of the rule. And really, the FDA can knock on any of our doors and ask for this data within 24 hours. So that's not 24 business hours, that's 24 hours. So it's on us to be able to have that data accessible and easy and have it in the right place and be complete. For us, it's those key data elements and critical tracking events. So key data elements can be things like quantity, lot number, location, date. And then those critical tracking events, I like to think of it, and we'll talk a little bit more here in a few minutes, but it's really the end-to-end. So from field to the back door at our dock as a retailer. In some cases, if we're moving product from one store to another store, there's additional responsibilities on us. And really the goal of the rule itself is also to have kind of an overarching traceability plan. So each entity that's kind of beholden to the rule has to have their own traceability plan documented. And that's something that can be certainly reviewed and part of any of those kind of conversations with the regulatory agencies. The when, we talked about it, it's January 20th, 2026. We did some quick math here. So today's October 9th, 2023. So 834 days from today, we need to be compliant on the rule. For those of us in retail, it's about 575 working days. So we took out, we have about 6 holidays at Wegmans, so I think we did a little quick math there. So it feels like a lot of time, but we're talking about technology, we're talking about changing processes, we're talking about working with our suppliers. It's going to require time, and we need to give everyone in the process enough runway to get us to that compliant state. So we'll probably, if we're going to, anything to add there? Or?
No, I think probably good, since you touched on the food traceability list, maybe you could go a little deeper here.
Yeah, so it's if you think about your retail store, you think about the store, it's all the perishable departments are well represented. You get stuff on the grocery side. So it's really understanding the items and the categories of items that exist on the list as an item themselves, but also items that exist as ingredients. So it's kind of twofold. So you can't just assume it's going to be, hey, we have an item, it's on the list, great, or it's not on the list, but if it's using an ingredient, there's some interpretation, there's some work you need to do there. Produce is highly represented on the list. Some good examples I like to throw out there for folks to get them thinking are, if you think about fresh cut fruit and fresh cut veggies are on the list. So broccoli is a perfect example. Broccoli, we sell a lot of broccoli. Broccoli is not on the list as itself, but in the minute you introduce it in a fresh cut state, now that becomes on the list. So it's really understanding, decoding the list, spending time in the list. Obviously, we have food scientists that know more than I. Like cheese is a category where they start talking about like water levels and pH. And I'm a supply chain guy. I don't get into that, but it's really interesting. There's a lot of work still to be done here, and we're certainly every day we're learning a little bit more. Sushi, which we'll touch a little bit, is a big thing for us, and really the ingredients that go into sushi. We do a lot of sushi production and store, and in some cases we transfer that product from one store to another. That's considered transformation in the world of FSMA 204. So we're really trying to dig in, learn. We're participating in a pilot, and we're really looking forward to it. But I don't know if you want to add anything on the list.
Yeah, I think Michael mentioned sushi, so we actually added that on here. If you go and look at the FTL for FDA, it won't have sushi on there, but it's just a really good example of, thin fish being modified into something else and how this list can become more expansive. Maybe talk about the indicators a little bit.
Yeah. So for us, I think this is one of these areas where we're certainly trying to learn more, right? And our suppliers will play a big role in this as well. Ultimately, they're not going to be, we're not going to know everything, right? So, and there's a concept of kill steps or exemptions that live in the world of FSMA 204. So depending on how they process it, depending the steps that goes into that processing, the item which you would think could be on the list might be exempt from the list. So it adds a further level of complexity. So for us, and we're spending a lot of time in the industry getting involved in work groups, but it's how do we ensure that we can use some of that master data? So the concept of a GDSN and setting it up an item with an indicator that says this is on the list or it's not on the list, and that we can propagate to all our systems and technology to help with that processing. That's one of the things we're really looking to do, because at the end of the day, we want to simplify this. And right now, just sitting here today, it's not simple with what's on the list or what's not. And I think we need our suppliers to help us play with that role. And there's a lot of exploration we're doing, right? So I think it's not as simple as today. I can tell you that we're impacted this many SKUs. It's not that simple today. So another fun fact I like to throw out here is which our food scientist told me a few weeks ago. Nut butters. So think peanut butter, right? So my mind started spinning of all the ingredients that use nut butters, and like, oh, where's the impact here? And that's certainly something that I think will be beholden to the exemption list. But I did get some good news. Pet food, so your dog bones that are filled with peanut butter, not on the list. So we can cross that one off, and it's pet food is exempt from the list today. The list is subject to change, though. So. What is it, 5 years?
Yeah. 5 years.
Yeah. 5 years, we got the list as it is today. So.
And if you layer in technology around the things that Michael just spoke about, is really it's about how do you make those processes more simple by enabling them with technology. So how do we identify what is on the FTL and what is not? How do we hold our suppliers accountable for getting that right? Or do we need to do that within the house of the retailer in terms of knowing what should and should not be on the list? So it's those type things, along with what Michael just referenced around identifying when a kill step has happened or when a processing step removes it from FSMA 204 and the requirements. Really, if you take a step back and look at that from a whole traceability plan perspective, then you really need to look at the whole store. So first thing I would say is on the FTL for FSMA 204, there is no chicken, there is no animal protein, there is no ground beef. And that's because the USDA oversees those products and the FDA oversees everything else. So if you think about bringing those two pieces together with this conversation, because you don't want to have different processes for one side of traceability and a different process for FSMA 204, there needs to be a way to potentially bring that together. When we look at this, and Michael, when I look at this is what this looks like for our supply chain and our suppliers in terms of what they have to deal with to comply with 204. So if we think about those critical tracking events and key data elements that Michael spoke about in terms of how things move throughout the supply chain and the need to track lot level across each of these instances. And we know that there's more, as it goes further along the supply chain, this gets more expansive. How do we actually do that and have those conversations that become really important with the suppliers? So Michael, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I look at this and I think there's an opportunity. We need to simplify, right? There's complexity to what we do here. But I also look at this and it's the concept of our suppliers play a big role in that, right? So I think there's a lot of work that we're have to embark with our partnerships to really help, because they're the ones that start the data and they flow that data downstream to us as a retailer or a receiver in a warehouse environment. So for us, it's really just understanding the key data elements all the way through. So we have the privilege at Wegmans to have an organic farm. So I'm now have to figure out solutions for our organic farm that grows tomatoes and other items that are on the list. We also have manufacturing facilities where we transform products. We age cheese that go through an aging process. So there's a lot that, as a retailer, it's not just the four walls of the retail environment and our warehouses. It's beyond that, and thinking where our touch points are. And for us, we've spent a lot of time really in discovery and really benchmarking that current state. But we're also participating in an industry pilot. And I think our goals out of the industry pilot are to work with a subset of key suppliers for us and really have them and show all the key data elements we need and basically track it from end to end and understand where our pain points are today, where our processes. We know it's not our end-all be-all solution that we're going to end up with in some cases, but at least we know we have an opportunity to learn, but also share with the industry. And that's our goal, is really, I think, a lot of what we're going to require on our suppliers should be a consistency across the industry. It's going to, like, you'll hear me say this probably multiple times today, we utilize those standards and make it easy on them. So the reality is we should simplify the ask by utilizing the standards, the industry standards, but it's also going to simplify the adoption, right? So for us, it's really just understanding the key data elements across here. But we're also really the key concept here, if you leave with anything else, is that lot code is going to be very important. Lot code's going to connect everything back in theory, right? But we obviously have some time to get there. And our goal is to learn, to explore, and really truly take that agile approach. Leah spoke a lot about agile earlier. For us, we're utilizing it because there is still interpretation to be done. There's still things being discussed in industry. So for us, it's really trying to learn, but also keep it in an agile way so we can kind of adjust as we interpret and learn more. So.
Yeah, and from a data perspective and sharing that data, it's really important for having those supplier conversations to understand what their challenges are. Because ultimately, the data has to come from them. It has to be accurate, has to be visible, has to be accessible, and it has to be, that accuracy is key. And so there's a lot of processes that not only need to take place in the retailer, but also in the supplier community. So having those conversations early with your suppliers and understanding what their challenges are. And from our perspective, we want to understand that too. And we're working to understand and really understand how that data is going to come and how long it will take them to get towards that standardized view. So that's a really important piece of this, is to be having those conversations. So Michael, could you speak to a little bit in terms of Wegmans' approach around, once you have those supplier discussions, how this impacts you from a retailer, or how you scope out your particular critical tracking events?
Yeah, so for us, I think it's boiling it down and simplifying it. So if you think about it from end to end, it can be overwhelming, right? Like thinking about all the touch points and all the things we need to do. So for us, we're really bringing folks together to have conversations. So we simplify the dialogue, but also that ensures that we're focused on the right things as far as the solve goes. A few areas of interest for us where I think we can help. Like I said earlier, we have some unique processes and a unique opportunity to potentially share a little bit more in the industry of what we're learning. Transformation is one of those areas. So that concept of, we're making sushi in one building and shipping it to another. Commissary exists in the retail environment. That's not a new concept, but just how can we share that information, the learnings there, in that process, what we learn, and how those standards can help us solve that downstream. So for us, it's really just understanding all those touch points. It's funny, we have these conversations, we're having a lot of dialogue and discovery around, and we kind of learn things, right? We discover things and here, and it just reemphasizes the complexity of some of this. But like one of the first things when I kind of took into this role, we started having conversations. We have vending machines that have salads in them. So That's never something we would have thought about. It's definitely an edge case, but it's one of those things that really, when you take a look at your four walls, think about where those areas that you might find that there are things that are not directly staring you in the face that you have to kind of have a solution for. So it's really taking that agile approach and making sure we're really simplifying it so that we can kind of go along our way and solve in a cadence that makes the most sense. So.
Right. I think too is, spending the time to really think about those critical tracking events that exist within your operation, because for each of you, it might be very different. So Michael referenced third-party production. Maybe your fresh cut program is being made by a third-party producer. They're going to be required to follow the FSMA regulation and provide that information to you. So some of those periphery programs that maybe have some of those production elements happening outside of your walls and coming in, those are ones to consider. And as Michael referenced, maybe you have single stores doing production and transferring that production to another store. That would be in scope here. So really making that exercise of understanding what critical tracking events apply to you. There's lots of receiving. So receiving is a key CTE for FSMA. But there's different ways we receive and ship information or product through the walls. So direct store delivery is one, and warehouse is another, and maybe we go to outside storage. So really thinking about how that product moves within your walls as it relates to FSMA, but then layering in the overall traceability aspect of how some of those things move as well. So Michael, can you speak to how Wegmans assembled the team or kind of approached this aspect?
Yeah. So I think, excuse me. So first and foremost, we started with executive level sponsorship. So we got the right folks in the room, Leah being one of them. So really, because this isn't going to be a food safety project, it's not a supply chain, it's a total company project, right? An initiative. So I think that was really key for us. And then we really did bring a cross-functional team together. So we've assembled folks from legal through supply chain, our master data, our merchandising, our merchants, IT obviously has a key seat at the table, our food safety team, our regulatory team. So really finding all those areas, because I think looking through FSMA, there's multiple lenses to this, right? It's not just one solve for kind of introducing a technology. There's a lot of conversations and things that have to be done. So really bringing that team together will help us. And they're also helping drive where that kind of that simplified work stream exists, right? So what are the things we need to be focusing on and really developing those as a team, right? Rather than it's just being kind of, this is what we're going to do, right? So that's been key for us. Leah kind of referenced it a little bit earlier, but our first and foremost goal is that minimum viable product, right? We want to be compliant, and we're really setting the stage for MVP, but we also want to set the foundation to take advantage of what traceability can offer us in the future. Really have that strategic mindset rather than just a tactical, we're going to become compliant. So for us, it's really getting that lens out there and focusing on the team. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, that really that resounding message of building what is needed to be compliant initially and really talking through those use cases, but then also building that foundation for the future around traceability in general, because as technology advances and ways to identify product in different ways, especially in the fresh space advances, really staying ahead of that and leveraging that in your traceability programs will be really important. And we'll touch on that in a moment as well. I did want to call out the fact that we will be putting this presentation, and then there's also a takeaway for this session around how you mobilize within your organization and just some of the key points around things that we're touching on, questions to take back and ask within your own organization to help remember some of the things that we've gone through today. So that will be the mobilizing your organization document.
And just to layer on, we talked about mobilizing in our organization. I think another key component here is mobilizing outside of our organization. So there's a lot of great industry work groups out there. We are participating in a few. FMI has one. For the retailers in the room. We also have one with GS1 US, and then Sally and I are both on the call. And it's certainly, I think, a good opportunity because consistency across the industry and our interpretation of the rule and our approach will be important. We're going to look to leverage standards, but I think as much as we do inside the organization, I think there's a touch point outside the organization that certainly can help with this as well.
So we're going to touch on data for a moment. You hear data come up in lots of different streams. It's no different for FSMA and traceability in general. You know, some of the challenges around data exist around legacy systems and trying to integrate those with other systems. What's interesting about this particular conversation is that particular topic also extends to your suppliers. It extends to the entire supply chain. They struggle with data just as much as retailers can in some of these categories. Fresh is more complex from a data perspective. There's lots of moving pieces. So really, it becomes a really big part of this conversation in terms of how the suppliers are able and ready to deal with data and be able to pass that accurately. And to Michael's point that he just made is really everyone going to solve this individually actually causes more problems. So from our perspective, we need to be agile to understand the scenarios in which suppliers and vendors are going to exchange data. But also driving, as Michael said, to a standard so that everyone is ultimately in the future talking the same language. I think about fresh in general in terms of how long it took them to get barcodes on the cases with labels that actually had lot in them. And what a big push that was from the fresh industry perspective, especially for meat and seafood. So if you think about, they went through all that, produce did it too. Some of those industries have really laid some really good groundwork there. Would you add to that?
Yeah, I think there's some learning, to your point, the PTI, Produce Food Traceability Initiative. I think there's some great learnings that can be distilled out of that. The DCA, the drug rule, obviously different environments. There's less manufacturers of drugs. There's less kind of components in the system, but they've been on a journey for the last 10 years around traceability. Not the same requirements, but I think there's certainly some learnings to be had there. And benchmarking from a data perspective. So
yeah, great. Let's dig into the data part of it. So we really think about this in 3 columns. So Michael, can you give us some details on the identification side?
Yeah. So if you're not familiar, GS1 is kind of a standards-based organization. They're the barcode people is kind of my tagline for them. I'm sure they have better ways to identify themselves. But so for Identify, it's really utilizing industry standards that exist out there today and really honing in on it. And I think we think about the data in a few different ways, right? We think about for me, I'll distill it down to like item setup, master data management, right? There's some information that we can glean for our traceability FSMA requirements ahead of time, where it doesn't have to be a transactional share every time, right? And it's things like item numbers. So think of a GTIN. That's a standard way of identifying your items. Or a global location number for a location we're picking up product, or a lot code source, right? So those are key data elements. So I would challenge you to really focus in on those and those standards from Identify on the kind of what I'll say is the master data side. Then transactionally, there's going to be things out there to really help us kind of bring the information. We have to share from one person to a supplier to a retailer, the next like link in the chain, really, right? So things like SSCC pallet labels are an opportunity to identify a lot. And there's a lot, like I mentioned earlier, there's an industry work group with GS1 and FMI, and there's a lot of great conversations really driving towards, from an identify, capture, share, really the idea of kind of consistency across. But there's also a concept, our goal is really that we identify from a GS1 standards perspective, but we also know we have some uniqueness as retailers. We purchase product from small suppliers that may or may not be on the list or exempt from the rule. It's a pretty nominal, I think it's a pretty small number, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to understand there's a concept of, we hope that we identify an industry standard from a setup perspective, but we also know we might have to meet folks where they're at. So capture and share, you want to talk a little bit more about stuff there?
Yeah, so certainly on the capture side, we just touched about it. So we know that the fresh industry in general had a big push to GS1 128 to allow them to put block codes into those barcodes and be able to extract that information quickly. So I would say predominantly they're there. There might be a use case where we even have suppliers that aren't quite there yet. So it's really understanding the supplier's ability to give the lock code in a way that you can capture it within their data. So they have to be capturing it. They bring it to you. It's a tool for you. So GS1 128 is really that, I would say that the starting point here in terms of barcode functionality and exchanging additional information within those barcodes. If we think more forward thinking in terms of what's coming and what's being enabled through barcode technology, when you look at some of these and you think about some of these as it relates to fresh, you might take us a while to get there, but it's really important to understand what's coming and also what's there today. So give an example of that is the two-dimensional barcodes allow for a lot more details about those products to be exchanged. So lot code is one of them, but there's also expiration date and things about shelf life and those type things that become really important from an ROI perspective as we move forward. Maybe not so much too much to bite off for FSMA, but really future thinking and where we're going. Staying ahead of that emerging technology is something that we think about from Upshop's perspective around how do we leverage those barcodes that enable us to know more about the products in terms of where they're going, how they're moving, and where they are in the supply chain. Additionally, RFID, funnily enough, is part of the FSMA conversation. It's technology that has been in the apparel space for a while, but it's definitely one of those that's part of the industry discussions that Michael spoke about around emerging tech and how we can not take a step back from a labor perspective in terms of how we have to capture all this information, but really do the right thing from a traceability perspective in terms of capturing it quickly, efficiently, and accurately within our process. So just something to think about. Certainly, we need to start with MVP, as Michael said, in terms of GS 128 potentially and connecting those pieces together. And then the other component to talk to the suppliers about is how they plan to share it with you. There's lots of, EDI as an example has been around for 40 years. That's one of those transactional sets that sits. Lot code was added to some of those EDI transaction sets for meat and poultry traceability, so it's there. But then they also talk about using things that are being used in drug and healthcare, which would be, I'm not going to go very deep here, but EPCIS is one of those languages and transactional sets that's being talked about sharing event data for even these fresh items. And I think the call out here is that it's going to take us a while to get there. So to Michael's previous point is really the meeting people where they are today. And it may be very different depending on which supplier that you're talking to. So from our perspective, we really think about it as having an agile approach to be open to whatever we think is going to be coming in from a supply chain perspective. Add anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think it's just really, I think there'll be a key component to this. GS1's data standards, I think, will help us with the solve, right? It'll simplify the ask of the supplier. It will simplify the adoption. My goal, right? This is my goal. My goal is that we as an industry can come together and kind of get that out there early next year. Because I think that's, if we're challenging, I think that's a challenge we can throw down, because we're going to need to give runway to our suppliers, our solution providers, to understand how they're going to play within the FSMA space. And I think that's really important to give them, you think about technology and onboarding suppliers, whether it's through EDI or making sure we have the right data. It takes time. And we have, as we referenced earlier, 575 working days. So
got to get going.
We got to get going. So.
Yeah, so we won't go too deep here, but everyone talking the same language is the takeaway.
Last thing, and just to jump in real quick, I think there's a lot of great resources out there. GS1, I think you're going to put some stuff in the appendix.
Yes.
That will be available. So I think there's a lot of great resources that kind of illustrate this. And just being part of those work groups, there's a lot of push to get that information out there as well. So I think be on the lookout for it.
Yeah, and if the folks that handle your GDSN, your EDI, those are the folks that will know about this particular slide, but it is a really important piece. So if it's not you, take this back and have those conversations and have them with your suppliers. So just to recap the highlights, Michael, can you touch on your highlights?
So I think there's some key components we're thinking about, right? Like what success look like in the future if we map out to that January 20th, 2026 kind of timeline. First and foremost, I think we're spending a lot of time simplifying the dialogue, right? It's It's a complicated topic. So the more we can simplify it, I think it helps in a lot of ways, right? And I think we're very much on an education journey, right? Not everybody, I've lived and breathed FSMA for a few months now, that's my day-to-day job, and not everybody else is doing that, right? So I think really helping simplify the dialogue, but also ensuring that kind of that agile approach, that we're focused on the right things and not trying to solve every edge case out of the gate. Let's solve and let's focus our attention on that minimum viable product. For me, like we just talked about, leverage the industry standards. I think about this in two ways, right? I think it's really leverage the industry standards. So the concept we just talked about with GS1 and really having that industry standard that we can put out there for folks and to understand and help them with the compliance and help them help us with the compliance, really. But also leverage the industry work groups, leverage conversations in the industry. I think we all have uniqueness to our operations. We have uniqueness to kind of how we're set up from it's a distribution network to our processes in the stores, but there's a lot we can benchmark off of each other. And I think of it in two ways, right? Like it's benchmarking of kind of where folks are going and kind of interpretation, but it's also making sure we're consistent with our interpretation, right? Like I as Wegmans don't want to be off solving something where nobody else in the industry is solving for, be compliant, right? Now, we might go do something from a traceability perspective to take advantage of it, but that's a different conversation. I think that's really for us to think about. And lastly, it's really, this has to be built around sustainable, repeatable processes. Leah talked a lot about employee experience. That's important to us. We don't want to layer on processes to folks where we don't have to. So how do we leverage technology? How do we leverage information share to simplify the processing? And I think at the end of the day, they have to be. I can't go out and just have people scan cases all day. That's not a viable solution for us. And I don't think it's a viable solution for a lot of other retailers out there, right? So that's really where our focus is. Yeah. And would you add to your kind of thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think to build on that, it's obviously MVP, considering what's needed for compliance, and then really understanding where are we going as an industry from a traceability perspective. What are our customers going to expect from us in terms of how quickly we can pull products from a store that are impacted by a foodborne illness? So it's really about considering today's compliance and then what we need in the future in terms of expedited recall, accurate recall. I would build on that and say that we can all go and design solutions for this particular problem, but it all is based on the data that comes into that system. So you can take in data from a supplier and you can have those results, but unless we have validated processes around that data and its accuracy, then it really is a non-compliant solve. So data becomes a really important piece. In addition, layered with, as Michael said, processes and systems to be able to have tech help you enable that traceability program so that we're really looking at it from a full view and incorporating the analytics needed to be able to have that traceability system. And then lastly, I would just say, partner and collaborate. If all the technology providers go and have different solutions, it's a really difficult problem for everyone to bring together, but really leveraging the technology partners that you have and let us help solve this with you in terms of those dialogues is really, really good for us.
Was that one thrown in for me?
It was,
sure.
yes.
Yes,
thank you.
Yeah. I think Sally wants to keep the partnership alive. So.
No, it's very helpful from a roadmap perspective for us to understand the challenges and continue to do so. That's great.